Thank you, and welcome to all of you from all over. Travel all over. I had a visit in Amsterdam and various other places recently. And the banking is everywhere, so the issues are relevant. We focus more on Europe and the US, where two of us reside, but the issues are everywhere. So here we go, then and now. So the start of this whole adventure of my career is the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, which, my advancing age means that students I teach sometimes, were kind of in grade school or something, if depending on their age. So it was a long time ago, 15, 16 years ago, whatever. And but it was a mark of a change in my career from just a sort of your run-of-the-mill corporate finance person to kind of realizing something kind of wrong with the system and asking a lot of questions. There were a lot of bailouts. I have slides with headlines about, Lehman Brothers and all of that. But the lasting effect was a housing crisis and a recession. And here we are. And after a crisis like this, a lot of people have narratives about the crisis, and there is be a little bit of a theme in this, in my 15 years, and in this talk of Jamie Dimon, and really with the maybe the quip that I may be influential, but I don't have as much power as Jamie Dimon. So that's a bit of a theme here in terms of who has power, whatever they say, even if it's wrong. And I have exchanged views with Jamie Dimon himself. So Jamie Dimon's narrative about the crisis essentially is stuff happens. He told his daughter that a crisis just happens every few years. And it matters what narrative you tell, because the issue is, is it like an earthquake and you just send the ambulances? Is it like a natural disaster, or is it preventable? And that was a question a lot of people asked, because if it's preventable, how should we prevent it? Because it wasn't that much fun. And recently we had a little flare up. So occasionally this stuff kind of comes into the front, like Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic Bank, Credit Suisse in spring 2023, which is why, by the way, I'll agree, the book was intended to be in 2023, but it only came out in 2024 because of these events, because we had to include them in the book. Instead of warning that they will happen, they actually happened. So we took more time until last summer to write, and then it only appeared in early 2024. So the other narrative in banking is oftentimes includes the word liquidity or panics and runs. So liquidity is like in the plumbing. I'll talk a little bit about what that means. And runs is like from the movies. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So oftentimes, the academics and the people involved are just really liking the word liquidity in banking. So it's always in the plumbing. Now, even before, they finished with the reforms, or they finished even with the investigation of the narratives and why we had a crisis, in the US, there was a Dodd-Frank Act, which was a massive, big law. And in the signing of that law, Barack Obama, the president, promised, here's a signing signature with Nancy Pelosi still around, Dodd and Frank were from the House and Senate, and he said, no more bailouts. In fact, he said no more bailouts, period. And there was a nearly 2-minute applause if you watch that scene. People didn't like the bailouts, and he promised no more. 6 months after the signing of Dodd-Frank, there was an inquiry commission, and the majority report of this commission essentially analyzed the causes of the crisis, no policy recommendation, unlike the Vickers Commission in the UK. And it basically said that the financial crisis was avoidable, that it basically reflected failures of government and governance. And governance is basically the theme of everything I'm interested in. I was interested in corporate governance before, and that was all about boards of directors and shareholder managers and all of that. But I now view the governance as much more of a broad issue about all institutions, public and private sector alike. And governance is fundamentally about the power people have, the constraints on that power, the information they have, and the incentives they have, and then how the system deals with the fact that some people have more power than others, some people have more information than others, and some people have incentives that might include harming others. In a book about the crisis, again, in a narrative, Michael Lewis, who wrote a book about the culture in banking called Liar's Poker back in the 80s, wrote this in the epilogue. So he's reflecting back on Liar's Poker. He wrote other books about sports and whatever. He said from the moment in 81 when Gutfreund took Solomon Brothers from a private partnership into Wall Street First Public Corporation, the Wall Street firm became a black box. So he's complaining about the opacity of the risk. The shareholders who financed the risk-taking had no real understanding of what the risk takers were doing. As risk taking grew ever more complex, their understanding diminished. And then he gives the following analysis towards the end. The problem wasn't that Lehman Brothers had been allowed to fail. Some people said it should have been bailed out. The problem was that it had been allowed to succeed. So he's agreeing with the narrative that it was prevented, that Lehman Brothers shouldn't have gotten to the point where we had the stark choice of bailing it out. Or letting it fail and the consequences of that. I'm skipping over 3 years in which I got into this debate, and I wrote this book. You'll find many, praises of this book. Here's one by Gene Fama, a Nobel laureate, famous professor in Chicago, still around. Must read for concerned citizens. The Banker's New Clothes should be studied and memorized by lawmakers and regulators so they won't be duped by false claims in the future. I'm going to get back to the false claims, the naked emperors and all of that later on. First, I'm going to do some actual teaching of the economics of it. Here's Martin Wolf's review of the book saying, banks are not special. This was basically, we were trying to teach about corporate finance and banking in the book, completely accessibly, no jargon. You can be a reporter, a politician, a policymaker. These are the people I so didn't understand, didn't take an MBA, got confused, or maybe people who got an MBA also got confused. Banks are not special except for what they're allowed to get away with. In other words, they always tell you banks are so special. Special in this very way is really what's going on here. The model is intellectually bankrupt, he said. And he was a member of the Vickers Commission, all of that, and still writes. The reason that this is not more widely accepted, so why I have no power, no influence, or not enough anyway, I have influence maybe, I'm hoping, and he gives two reasons here. Bankers are so influential, so it's about power, and the economics are so widely misunderstood. So I'm going to try to clarify the economics of it, and then we're going to get to the politics of it and the power of it and other things. So this is the book in 2024, which is basically the old book with the table of content on the right, and or with the left, whatever you see it left, actually. And then next to it is the added 4 chapters with the title Undermining Democracy and the Rule of Law. So I'm going to end with that. And it explained why the system's still too fragile. It explains a lot more than we did in the old. Well, it explains how central banks work. So bailouts, central banks, and the role of different institutions. I'll give you a hint of that in a bit. And then it talks about why they keep being bailed out. And then it goes to the law. So I'm going to give you a flavor of all these issues in the old book, in the original book, and which is still intact, and the new edition. So this is how they look one next to one another. I actually brought in, so I have them, one is thin and one is fat, 200 pages extra in the new edition relative to the paperback of 2014. So the book came in 2013, paperback 2014. One of the things we focus on here and explain the economics of is debt, and especially corporate debt. But there's debt at all levels. There's household debt, there's corporate debt, there's government debt. There are some commonalities and some differences between debts of corporations, of banks, and of others, households, governments. Let's talk about mortgages just to get into the topic. In the book, we were told we couldn't get into the topic of corporate debt before we explained a little bit about personal indebtedness. And here's Kate, fictional borrower buying a house with a mortgage, and she puts 5% in. We have slightly different numbers in the book. 5% out of a $400,000 house. You can't buy anything for that in the Bay Area. Anyway, so the rest is borrowed money, and we're going to ignore interest right now and time elapsing and a lot of things just to show the following, the magnification of risk from borrowing, the leverage, what's called, okay? So if the house goes up by 5%, because she gets all the gains and she just returns it. So we're doing it kind of instantaneously. She returns the money and she keeps another 20,000, which is 100% return on the original 20,000. So because it sort of gets magnified from 5% to 100% on the upside, and if the house goes up by 10%, she triples her money from 20 to 60%, and that's a 200% return on her investment. Now, it doesn't look so pretty on the downside, because if the house goes down by 5%, then she lost all her $20,000 already. And if the house goes down by 10%, she's what you can call underwater. So underwater is the analogy of sort of insolvent institution, meaning if she sold the house, she couldn't pay the mortgage. Now, it depends on the terms of the mortgage, whether she can walk away, like corporations can, limited liability, and can leave the house to the lender, or she still, must pay it out of her other assets. But in any case, the house itself will not cover the mortgage, because it's worth $360 and she owes $380. So that's the underwater situation, okay? Now, if she defaults, meaning she promised a payment and she's not paying, then it could be for different reasons. And that's where we get into the word liquidity. You might not pay your debts because you have some assets in some faraway country. And in order to pay your debt in cash, write a check, make a transfer, you need to have access to that cash. And maybe your asset is illiquid. It's a piece of land or something like that. So you might have just a temporary liquidity problem because you have to convert your assets to cash. And so if you can't do that, then you might default, but that's sort of one type of problems. But you might actually have a most serious problem, which is a solvency problem, which is you sort of can't pay. Now, you might go to Las Vegas if the debt is not due yet and gamble everything away, and maybe you will be able to pay. But, today, under normal circumstances, you're kind of unable to pay. That's like Kate being underwater. She can't pay with the house anyway. So if she just, didn't come up with the money, she will default. Now, it's important why there is default. So they always like to say that banks get in trouble because of liquidity problem, when in fact they may very well have solvency problems. Solvency problems are very challenging because an insolvent borrower, if they don't default, are very unhealthy. That's where we're going to get to the concept of zombies, etc. And because they still have control of some assets, and they can harm the creditors or society. So solvency problems are serious, and they may themselves create liquidity problems, as they do in banking when the depositors run. So banks start with, you noted the color coding of my house. I didn't want to present balance sheets because the lay audience doesn't understand balance sheet, but we did present balance sheets in the book, debt, equity, and the house as an asset. So for corporations, we know what the balance sheets are. You're all MBA students, so you've learned accounting. And then for banks, deposits are on the liability side. So they are debt colored red. And I colored equity yellow, green, okay? So the interesting thing about deposits is there are a few special things about deposits, in particular that people can get their money out anytime on an ATM or in a bank transfer. They can use them for payment. So, but to the bank, they are debt that they have to be ready to pay you in cash when you want. Now, bank runs are an extreme case of liquidity problem when everybody wants their money at the same time. And why might that be? Well, either they really suddenly need it, but that usually is predictable, or they might be worried that the bank can't pay them or that other people will get the money before them. Now, if the bank is really solvent, it's very rare that just suddenly, everybody wants their money and then the bank's assets are illiquid and they can't fulfill it, which is what you might say. But, that's very unlikely. That happens in the movies, okay? In Mary Poppins or in It's a Wonderful Life, I'll give you a wonderful life in a second, that there was a sudden run of healthy banks. Usually it comes from solvency problems. But the history of banking had a lot of runs. And, we can delve into why banks are always fragile, because they kind of want to be and they get away with it. But over the years, we gave more and more safety nets to the banks, so people don't have to worry about their money. We gave deposit insurance. We added central banks. So I'm going to talk about all the safety nets in a second. And they kind of, they are good until they are a bit excessive, as they are in banking. And now we kind of took care of it. We told depositors not to worry. Here's from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Here is George Bailey, who was, this is a movie from the 1940s, saying, your deposits are invested in the mortgage of your neighbor. What am I going to do? Foreclose on them? In other words, it's illiquid. And then in the movie, he reaches into his pocket and he pays them. That's as if Jamie Dimon was going to pay the depositors of JP Morgan Chase. Not going to happen today. But in the movies, there was a hero and he didn't want to liquidate the houses or foreclose on the houses somehow. And he paid out of his own money and everything was great in the end. We created deposit insurance after there were a lot of bank runs in the Great Depression, and there was a bank holiday, all kinds of problems happened. In the US, we created deposit insurance. In some countries, deposit insurance is just in the government or implicit, where people believe that the government will cover their deposits up to a limit. Right now, officially, the limit in the U.S. is $250,000. But, in SVB, they bailed everybody out, and they do. So I'm going to mention that in a second. FDIC is also, instead of a bankruptcy, which is a legal process for people who can't pay their debt, FDIC resolved failed banks, and they keep talking about resolution and bail-ins and all this, which is what happens in bankruptcy to corporations. They just restructure. In banking, they basically also kind of sell the assets, whatever else. And FDIC kind of supervises, it's a regulator. Now, this thing that the deposits are debt, in one of the most ridiculous claims in terms of nonsense, I'll bring up something that John Stumpf, the CEO of Wells Fargo, where my money was at the time in 2013, right after the book came out, said to a journalist, because we have a lot of self-funding with consumer deposits, we don't have a lot of debt. I had deposits with him, so he seemed to have forgotten that he owes me the money. And the ridiculous thing about this is that, they have a lot of debt, including in deposits, but the deposit debt in particular doesn't feel to them like debt. So they can be very heavily indebted, but unlike other borrowers, it doesn't feel like they're indebted because depositors are so passive as creditors. They leave it to the regulators to take care of the risk and of how much equity there is and all of that. So in the book right now, we explain about central banks. Central banks create money, but banks do not create money. The balance sheet of central banks is really a bizarre thing because they say that the banknotes, we explain all of this in the book, that the banknotes, the cash is like their liabilities, but in fact, they can print them. So in banking, what ends up happening between the deposits and other debt, they are indebted to the gilt. No corporation lives like this. They can have and they're allowed to have single-digit amounts of equity, depends how you count, and off-balance sheet beyond belief. So, most corporations don't choose, without no regulation, to have so much debt. So a lot of high-tech companies just fund with venture capital equity, but banks just permanently live like that. I can go through the whole economics of funding, but I'll just show you that historically, banks had a lot more equity, and certainly before the safety nets, 25% equity, whatever. Mid-19th century, banks were partnerships with 50% equity and unlimited liability, meaning the owners had to pay depositors if the bank couldn't. And after the 1940s, they became limited liability corporations. Sometimes they had double and triple liabilities, so they were the last kind of organizations to become limited liability. And as the safety nets expanded after, in the last decades, they wanted to and got away with having much less equity. So, for example, Barclays Bank, 92 to 2007, had this deposit funding, this much money market fund funding, which are just kind of institutions that came in between. We gave our money to money market funds and they lend it short term to the bank. And other debt, so all of this is various shades of red, and you can see the balance sheet growing of Barclays, a UK bank, and if you strain your eyes, you see a little bit of equity. So you can see that Barclays, entering the crisis of 2007 to 9, was very fragile, and so were the other banks. The system became incredibly complicated. So to see through it, you will need a magnifying glass and you will not understand all the money slushing around. I won't go through it. This is just from an IMF, but there are many, many pictures of how complicated the system is. And what can happen in this kind of system is you have a fragile institution, very connected through contractual links and other ways to many other institutions, like money market funds, like derivative markets, all kinds of other things like that. And then, if they lose their equity, then you have a contagion mechanisms. We call them banking dominoes that take down the system, and here you have Uncle Sam bailing out the banks. So why don't they have more equity? Well, they have a mantra that equity is expensive, but they keep sort of forgetting expensive to whom. So if they are subsidized so that equity is expensive for them, who's providing those subsidies? And who is the equity that they hate so much expensive for? And then why is it not expensive for other corporations that, don't have 5% equity on a regular basis? They could lever more. They could, do a buyback, and pay themselves dividends, etc. Here is the extreme example. What if our borrower, Claire, had a very wealthy Aunt Claire, and Aunt Claire said, Kate, go to the bank and ask them to lend you money to buy a house, and tell them that I'll pay if you can't. Now, Kate can go to the bank and say, look, my aunt is guaranteeing she's very rich, so I will pay you for sure. The bank gives her a cheap loan because it's riskless debt to the bank. There's no chance she will default. It doesn't even need down payment from her. So she buys it with all debt, no equity mortgage. And why should she buy a small house? She wants to buy a big house now. She doesn't need any cash of her own, and the bank will give her money as long as her aunt is good for it. And she gets the upside. We call it arbitrage in the rest of finance. She puts no money in, and she takes the upside and walks away from the downside. Now, she tells her aunt that equity is expensive. She can take the money and put it in treasuries or, something safe and get a sure return and not expose it to any risk of the house going down. So she prefers to put zero equity in the house. Now the banks have Uncle Sam. So this is our cute transition in the book from Aunt Claire to the guarantees of the banks, the safety net. And the safety net comes in many forms. If you have deposit insurance, all of a sudden in a crisis, they set up to 100, and all of a sudden it became infinity. Everybody got insured. They start giving guarantees to non-deposit debt. I'll tell you an example in a second. They enter loss sharing agreements with the buyers of the banks. And so deposit insurance can act as a way to prevent default more than the way it was intended or is supposed to. Now, the treasuries, these are taxpayer money, can get involved to invest in the banks or to take over the banks. So in the US, they called it TARP. It was a bailout. Or you bail out, the Greek government, and the Greek government pays the banks, in the Greek crisis. So there are all kinds of indirect ways to bail out the banks. In COVID, they bailed out, all kinds of people, and the banks sat in the middle. The government can nationalize. They don't like to do it in the US, but they did it in a number of European countries, in the UK. Or the government can tell the central bank to make certain loans, risky loans, and they'll back them up. They did this in COVID, and they did it again after SVB. The central banks are there as kind of the banks, and they can give liquidity support. So they are what's called lender of last resort. But the loans that they give can become subsidized and low interest loans, like that happened in Europe. They'll give them 1% loans, or they go in and buy assets. And the reason they do this is because they can and want to. So they can grow their balance sheets from, under $1 trillion in the US to $4 trillion after, the financial crisis, to $9 trillion after COVID, the Federal Reserve, our central bank. ECB, same. They can lower the interest rate, what's called Greenspan put or Bernanke put or Janet Yellen put or whatever. So all of a sudden they make things, they're borrowing cheaper. And then in the US, we have all kinds of other lenders of last resorts, all kind of other guarantees that step into the system to kind of, prefer certain things or guarantee certain things. Here's just one example. In the financial crisis, the FDIC started a program that, just like Aunt Claire, told all the banks, including banks that didn't have deposits, that just became bank holding companies, what's called in the US. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and of course, JP Morgan Chase, all of them told them, go raise money in markets. We'll guarantee it. We, the FDIC, this was raising bonds in markets. And then what happened? They went, and of course, they could raise bonds with a guarantee of the FDIC, and then they paid back the Treasury for all the bailout money that they received from Treasury. And everybody said, oh, how wonderful. Why did they want to do this? Because the Treasury program that gave them money put a little bit of restriction on dividends that they could pay out or on salaries of bankers. They didn't like that. They wanted to go back to paying dividends and depleting their equity. And so they paid it back with a program that had no strings attached. And then they paid back, and everybody said, look at how the bailouts work. They paid back. So here's this concept of zombies. It's a box that says, don't open, dead inside. I don't want you to avert your eyes seeing a zombie. But a zombie are insolvent corporations or underwater, basically. They don't default, so we don't necessarily know that they're insolvent. But in banking, they can persist. Most zombie corporations that become insolvent can't last long because their creditors will worry. But in banking, the creditors can stay passive and not do anything. If the regulators don't do anything, then they can live. And this happened in the savings and loan in the US. And this is potentially happening right now because you support sick banks. This happened in Europe, which is why the banking system was so dysfunctional for many years after the crisis. Never actually, making them healthy. And they can do this while pretending on balance sheets to be safe or to be solvent. This is a cartoon that says, don't worry, it's done under the GAAP, accounting standards that we teach in our accounting courses here, different accounting system in Europe. So KPMG, the audit company, didn't raise any flags about all the banks that failed here, didn't say anything was wrong with them, even though, as we show in the book, and many people showed, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, First Republic banks were completely insolvent for months before. And it was in front of you, especially for Silicon Valley banks. They had bonds that lost in value and they didn't have assets to pay their debts until people realized this and started running. These are two clever, smart, savvy investors. One of them was a Fed governor who basically say banks' disclosures are no good. I was in Davos with Paul Singer from Elliott Management, and he said, I can't understand the risk. You read their disclosures, you don't understand anything. So just whatever numbers you see, you're not getting into it because there's so much off balance sheet and so much hidden in derivative. In the book, we analyze the balance sheet of JP Morgan Chase. And, I won't go through all the details, but, there are a few noteworthy things. This is by two accounting systems, one in US and one in Europe. We're talking balance sheets in the trillions. If people say, Apple is the largest or, whatever, NVIDIA is the largest, the banks are the largest. If you include the debt, not by market value, where they have so little equity, but by asset value. And even without, depending on how you do the asset accounting. Anyway, the bank is was $4 trillion, this 2011, $4 trillion in the Europe, if it reported in Europe, and $2.25 in the US. Out of this, the loans it made were less than the deposits it took in. So a lot of it was trading assets, like a hedge fund with a little deposit taking. So they present themselves like these quaint, savings banks. But what they are big, huge trading operations with a little bank too. So the fortress of JP Morgan Chase at the time in 2011 was sitting on this much equity. He called it a fortress balance sheet, Jamie Dimon. This is now comparing GAAP 2011 to 2021. So in the decade since we wrote the book, and even till 2024 right now, JP Morgan Chase grew a lot. So when they say no more too big to fail, nonsense. The bank kept growing and kept growing and kept growing. And even now it bought First Republic Bank. And by now it's about $4 trillion, $2.5 trillion of deposits, $1 trillion of loans, and lots of trading operations. And off balance sheets, more than before the crisis. You don't even see all the commitments off balance sheet. Now, $1 trillion is a lot of money. These are $1,000 bills stacked up 68 miles high. It was 680 miles high if it was $100 bill stacked up to make $1 trillion. Just so you understand how much money that is on the asset side of JP Morgan Chase. So this is now JP Morgan Chase, $2.5 trillion, $4 trillion of assets, except for off balance sheet. So we had a crisis. And this was March 10th, where all the run happened in Silicon Valley. And on the 12th, which was a Sunday, there was a joint statement by Treasury, Federal Reserve, and FDIC saying, I'll highlight, Secretary Yellen, Treasury, approved actions by the FDIC to ensure all depositors, average deposit size in Silicon Valley Bank was $4 million. No haircut, no loss from these depositors. And they said that no losses will be borne by taxpayers. It's magic, magic. Everybody will get paid and no losses. Now, the FDIC lost $20 billion on this. What's that? Not taxpayer money? Well, the FDIC is going to charge the other banks. That's somebody who didn't take that debt. So, in addition, the Federal Reserve announced that it will make loans to all banks, overvaluing their collateral, pretending that they didn't lose as much as they did lose. So there were new programs, and I don't go into it here, but we explained it in the book. And this is what they call no more bailouts. They don't like the word bailouts because they promise not to bail out. So, you know, a blogger you might follow said SVB couldn't ignore its losses, but the Fed can. The Fed is going to pretend that the banks didn't lose and lend them money. So that's like somebody has a house worth $800,000 and you lend them $1 million. JP Morgan Chase doing great after it bought First Republic. Awesome to be Jamie Dimon. I teach various courses in the business school, and this is a course I taught called Power in Finance, just before all this crisis happened. And we gave an assignment on Credit Suisse a month before it collapsed. And we said in the assignment, you're going to read some stuff about Credit Suisse, which is the current zombie. And you're going to, let's see if they let it fail or not. Sure enough, they didn't let it fail in Switzerland. They bailed them out in a combination of their SNB and all of that. And I can go into that. We go a little bit into it in the book. And this investigation talked about how it became a zombie, dead bank walking. Depends how you do the accounting, whether it's balance sheet or solvent or whatever. So a little bit of nonsense, okay? I gave you the nonsense from Stumpf. But this is what I really fell into. The Stumpf nonsense was after the book, and it's in the new edition. I really fell in a rabbit hole in 2010. When I started looking into banking as a corporate finance professor, I just couldn't believe it. They were talking about the word capital is a lingo that they use in banking to denote sort of equity. They call it a rainy day fund, which is like cash reserve. This is just false. You know, they're confusing two sides of a balance sheet. But this is like they say hold capital. And they're confusing cash reserves with, and so we explain all this. This is so insidious. It continues to today. Capital is a rainy day fund, which is false. But the lobbyists love it because the lobbyist is going to say every dollar in capital is less dollars in the economy. The American dream will be over if you ask them to have more equity funding, if you stop their dividends. So much nonsense. You know, the lobbyists coming in 2015, same playbook. Rule will keep billions out of the economy. Kate's equity is invested in the house. Equity is invested in things. That's not a cash reserve in a drawer. This is Ackerman saying equity will have a negative effect for all. And here is the honest guy. Paul Volcker said, and we only learned about it after the book was done, and now we quote it, and I quoted it in Davos, including the word bullshit. Just about whatever anybody proposed, the banks will claim it will restrict credit and harm the economy. It's all bullshit. And he confirmed that he said that to a senator, okay, in a book. So now we enter the politics. So all bullshit. How will credit be stopped if you just paid a dividend? You could have made a loan with it. By now, we have a collection published online, available to all as accompanied to the book, 44 different flawed claims and a short debunking, okay? Recently updated, we've collected it from 23 up to 44 over the last 11 years since the book was written. Because it doesn't matter that you say the emperors are naked. They keep marching down the street. They keep getting away with it. Why? They're the most powerful lobby in Capitol Hill, and they own the place. This is a senator after the crisis, right after the crisis. This was in the first edition of the book. If you want to understand the politics, power. This is what a lobbyist said after the Dodd-Frank Act was passed. This was the halftime, he said, the halftime. Why? Because they do the lobbying for the law, and then they continue the lobbying to, undo parts of the law, to go to say that, here's just one example, okay? I mean, what I say to my students, it's not halftime, it's a never-ending game. They'll always try to, reduce it. This was one little thing that happened in 2014 after the first edition of the book. There was a piece of the law that they didn't like. And the piece was basically saying that they couldn't do all the derivative trading on the same balance sheet as the bank, Citibank inside Citigroup, the subsidiary that's the bank, the deposit-taking institution. They would like to put the derivatives on the same balance sheet because the derivative counterparties love being ahead of depositors because they'll never lose. And Citigroup wrote a piece of a sort of basically dropping a part of Dodd-Frank that was hidden in a must-pass bill that there was no discussion of this or nothing. And Jamie Dimon himself called policymakers to just vote for it with no discussion, just as part of a spending bill that would have been a government shutdown if they didn't sign a package deal. So they snuck it in, basically. So it was just tricks and tricks and tricks to get what they want, okay? So in the politics of bankers, the robber said, why did you rob a bank? Because it's where the money is. I thought it was a lame joke, but it's a deep joke, okay? The banks are where the money is. That's what you want to rob. That's who you want to use. Guarantees appear free to policymakers. Banks seem like a source of funding for what you want, not risk. So you ignore the risk. They're national champions when they compete with other banks. Central banks hide, bail out everybody. Governments, banks sit in the middle. Everybody's confused or willfully ignorant. So they get away with things. I started this in 2010, my battle, when I realized what was going on, and I was asked by some policymakers to get involved. And fortunately, I have tenure at Stanford, and I put aside everything else, and I did it full-time for 5 years. And I gave up taking on my previous colleague, Ben Bernanke, in an op-ed saying, where is the courage? You had the courage to save, but not the courage to stop a dividend in Bloomberg. Posted, all my op-eds are available PDF on my website. The nonsense continues. This is after the book, or after the book was in printing, in a hearing in Congress, and I wrote a little bit about that again. And this is virtually my sign-off. 44 flawed claims, nonsense and bad rules persist in banking. I have other interests right now. In banking, they always kick the can down the road. It's a hopeless battle, and they have many enablers. It takes a village. Comes from the movie Spotlight about all the enablers of sexual harassment in the church. There are many people who stand by, who benefit, who wouldn't speak up, including academics. It's really been a very sobering experience. Here's R.J. Miller saying, making money is the easy part, making the world a better place is the hard part. So R.J. Miller, for you alums, is my hero. He understood the role of government, the role of business in the world. And I wrote to this, Capitalism Laws and the Need for Trustworthy Institutions. And I have an initiative at the business school called CASI, Corporation Society Initiative, that was mentioned in my intro. We have a lot of events that are not quite view from the top, but view from the media, from policymakers, from insightful people. And I started a program, a sister program in the Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law on capitalism and democracy. Anyway, I flew through the slides, but, you know, in the debate about capitalism and you know, big government or small government and all the nonsense that we're presented with, some false choices about, you know, socialism, totalitarianism versus market capitalism, all of that. What's really going on is, again, a lot of confusion. There's no markets without rules. And the rules have to come from somewhere. They might come from, you know, contracts, but the contracts need enforcement. They might come from government. They have to come from someplace, or we don't have markets. No rules, no markets. The forces of capitalism have basically undermined and overwhelmed our democratic institutions today. So you can have, you know, the government controlling speech, like in Russia or China, and you can go to jail for the truth, or you can have free speech like we have here, and you know there's still propaganda from the private sector or from government, both. So there's a lot of confusion that can filter into the discourse. In an expanded version of it, and in the book, we talk about a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, and it's about the public discourse becoming nonsense. And so what I say in this diagnosis, asked what's gone wrong with capitalism and how to fix it in 2021, is that we need to get at truth. In the book, we end by saying truth needs more power, not speaking power to truth, but we need to empower truth somehow so that we have a democracy and a system that does not have as much deception in the private sector and in government that distorts our markets and distorts our politics. So that's what I'm searching for.
Alec, go ahead and unmute yourself. Feel free to ask your question.
Oh, thanks. I might be cutting the line. I meant to just do the clapping because I loved it, but I'll try to be quick. You know, one of your points is about the opacity of financial practices. What do you think are the right ways to combat that? Is it more regulation, or is it more education, or both?
That's a great question. I've been going around. Actually, I met yesterday a visitor to our accounting seminar who's a PhD in accounting from here, because I've been begging accounting people to come to terms with how difficult it is to capture derivative risk, especially in financial disclosures. Somebody wrote a paper, somebody who was actually a chief economist in the SEC, called a law professor, too big to depict. And he just meant the incomprehension that Paul Singer from Elliott Management was referring to, that there's so much risk in derivatives. So those of you who studied in the GSB, some of the years that I taught here, we did teach more on derivatives. They are basically, you know, these side bets, these contracts that, for example, think of a forward contract. We promise to transact in the future at a fixed price today. On a balance sheet, there's no money transferring hands today, so it's zero market value. It won't enter a balance sheet at all, but there's risk to one side or another. So it's very hard to capture, certainly in balance sheet, but even in income statements and other financial disclosures, the risk of an entity that has trillions and trillions in notional values of derivatives. So the aggregation of the derivative is done by the OCC in the US. So there's quarterly disclosures. And I talked recently in Swiss National Bank in a recent visit. In the Dutch National Bank in Amsterdam. I talked recently to somebody who told me that there is data on that. My answer to you is we need to find a way to capture that risk. At least the regulators must do that. When they do all this stress testing and all of that, they cannot possibly, it's such a knotted thing. I once asked the FDIC officials, because I was involved in some advisory committee to the FDIC, and I got to talk to them, and I asked them, how do you understand your own exposure to JP Morgan Chase derivative trading? In principle, you're bearing the risk of $2.5 trillion of deposits. Now, the reason the FDIC who is in no position to insure $18 trillion. The reason they sleep at night is because the FDA, the Fed is not going to let JP Morgan Chase default on anything. So that's how it really works. But it's not. They told me the following fact. At a given snapshot, JP Morgan Chase has 1 million, and this was a few years back, maybe 6 or 7 years back, 1 million contracts open. 1 million, just get your head around that. 1 million contracts against different counterparties, all of them either cancel risk or magnify risk, depending. So it's really a very difficult thing to figure out, especially when it comes to derivative, how to capture the fragility of an individual bank or the system as a whole. And I think good minds need to pay attention to that. And it's just unsolved. We have the data. It's just that risk keeps moving in derivative. That's a whole thing, that it's dynamic leverage.
Yuta, I'm wondering if you would like to ask about moving risks or
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting and helpful. My question is, I often hear the argument that if we regulate banks, then the risk taking will move to the non-bank sector. That is more difficult, more shadower kind of thing. So how we can reduce the risk of regulatory arbitrage without
So in my
harming
slides, there was a slide saying these new rules will completely change a cartoon. These new rules will change the way we get around them. So and I was asking in that, what's the source of profits? Is it, beneficial innovation? I'm skeptical that all innovations are good. Some say the like button in social media was not a great innovation. But anyway, or regulatory arbitrage is just ways to get around the rules, or misconduct. Now, to your question, when I went to DC to talk about the new edition of the book, earlier in 2024, this question kept coming up, even when I met policymakers in Washington. Shadow banks. It's one of the 44 flawed claims. Activities will run to the shadows. I have two answers to that. One answer is, let 1,000 shadow banks bloom. You can make loans out of any money. I can have an all equity, venture fund and make loans. We now have a lot of private credit. And is that good or bad? It turns out that a lot of institutions in the shadow lending, and there's a study by one of my colleagues, that when you have mortgage lenders that are not banks, they have a lot more equity, like 20-25%. And they're funded in markets, not with deposits. And they're not regulated like banks. So maybe they're less fragile, maybe fine. The problem remains that the big banks, if they don't make loans, they're just gambling. And they have this cheap funding. So that remains a problem, the too big to fail institutions. So when people come to me and say, I'm going to start such an ethical, good bank, I say, Jamie Dimon's going to eat you for breakfast. That's the problem, is they're so privileged. And we all like our money safe. And it's safe in JP Morgan Chase because it's too big to fail. So on the shadow banking, I think that, we need to tailor the regulation to what's risky. If banks are taking deposits and depositors are passive, then we must regulate deposit-taking institutions. We're giving them an enormous privilege and access to central banks. And that is something that, we must do. They must be responsible when they're so privileged. And they're not. They're just not. So the shadow banks, some of them don't bother me as much. Some of them, and this is my second part of my answer, and that's important too. If you trace shadow banks, you find the banks. So what ends up happening is that in the way they're layered, in the regulatory arbitrage of the banks, they are funding the shadow banks. And oftentimes, I'll give you an example from the crisis. So in all the securitizations that happened, securitization meaning that they took a bunch of mortgages and they put them off balance sheet in a special purpose vehicle in another entity. And then that entity issued securities that were tranched, AAA, AA, etc. And they sold these securities to pension investors and others, oftentimes fraudulently, presenting them as good when they were really not. And the bank that was organizing it, that was doing the securitization, they gave sometimes implicit guarantees to the special purpose vehicle. And that meant, and so for example, newly released evidence from Citigroup showed, and I didn't know this actually until recently, that Citibank had $40 billion. Citibank, this is the insured bank. Citibank had $40 billion of commitments off balance sheets to these securitization vehicles that would have gone to the FDIC and made an enormous hole in the FDIC Deposit Insurance Fund should they let Citigroup fail, which Sheila Bair, the head of FDIC, wanted to do. Citigroup and Bank of America were zombies, well-known fact during the financial crisis and in the years after. Their market value was half their book value. They were pretending to be healthy, and Citigroup got bailed out 3 distinct times, including bailout just special for Citi, because Tim Geithner was completely committed to bailing Citi out. And there's a book just on Citi called Borrowed Time, boom, bust, and crisis in Citigroup, 200 years of that. And so it's a symbol of bailouts in the US, Citigroup, okay? And Citigroup ended up, I didn't know this, I thought that it was the investment bank that was really insolvent, but it was the bank too, once you take into account their off-balance sheet commitments. So, in other words, the shadow banks in the special purpose vehicle, the credit default swap, the money market funds that were also bailed out, they were often connected in various ways to the banking system itself. So if you're going to solve this problem, you need to regulate the banks first and foremost and follow the money into the shadow banking system, and then regulate or not as needed.
Thank you.
There's a question here about how students who are going into finance are taking all of this. I'm curious as to what reaction you get from GSP students who are pursuing careers in finance. If any remain who are not interested in going into becoming entrepreneurs.
That's such a great question. So yeah. I have friends from within the financial sectors. I have friends that are all over the place. The students who go to finance, I love them. They'll go be a little cog in this machine. My main complaints are to the regulators and to the academics and to the people who enable it, because people will say what they get away with saying. So that kind of triggers me less than, it triggers me when it interrupts my podcast with stupid ads, and I complain to Jamie Dimon myself on this, but my courses are not listed in finance. I teach courses that are very interdisciplinary, and they're listed as GSB Gen. I have people who go in and out of finance as CASI leaders. My initiative is very much student powered because I don't have many resources, and the student guarantees are the student volunteers are the ones that fill the events with actual people, thoughtful people. And I've become much more attached to the students and feel that the faculty are the ones not engaging. I say this to their face, so whatever. Anyway, that was a troublemaker. So they know it. If they take my class, they understand more of it. They don't always get it in the finance courses. If I nudge my colleagues in some courses, they do get some perspective like that. Or, even in a real estate course, which includes politics. So I encourage all my colleagues to include issues around society, issues around politics, and not be afraid.
Perfect. And with that, we are at time. Thank you so much, Anat, for joining us.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to have you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hope to
Thank
see
you all. Feel free to write to me. I'm Anat Admati at Stanford.edu.